In the winter of 1347, when snow fell silent as prayer and cold bit deeper than any blade, two souls lived within the same castle walls, yet inhabited different worlds entirely. Good evening, dear friend. As you settle into the warmth of your bed tonight, let me take you back through the mists of time to a place where stone walls rose high against winter skis, where fires blazed in some halls while frost crept through others, and where the accident of birth determined whether one would feast or freeze. Close your eyes and let us walk together through those ancient corridors, where the past whispers its stories to those willing to listen. In the great castle of Ashenmore, perched on the cliffs of northern England where the North Sea winds howled like wolves, there lived a young woman named Elinor. She was 19 years old that bitter winter, though sometimes she felt ancient as the stones themselves. Her hands were rough and chapped, her fingernails broken and rimmed with dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. She had been born in a small cottage at the edge of the castle's lands, the third daughter of a family too poor to keep her fed. And so, at 7 years old, she had been sent to work in the kitchens. That had been 12 years ago now. 12 years of rising before dawn and collapsing after dark. 12 years of heat and steam and endless labor. Elinor's face still held traces of the child she had been, a certain softness around her eyes that no amount of hardship had quite erased. Her hair was the color of autumn chestnuts, though it was always hidden beneath a rough linen cap, and her eyes were gray as winter seas. She was small and slight, as most of the servants were, their growth stunted by years of poor food and hard work. But there was a strength in her thin arms, a resilience in the set of her shoulders. She had survived 12 winters within these walls, and that was no small thing. The castle itself was a massive edifice of gray stone, built 2 centuries earlier by a Norman lord whose descendants still ruled these lands. Its walls were 15 feet thick in places, designed to withstand siege and storm. The Great Hall occupied the heart of the structure, a vast space with a ceiling that soared 30 feet high, supported by thick oak beams blackened by centuries of smoke. At one end stood an enormous fireplace, large enough that 3 men could stand inside it side by side, where whole logs burned day and night throughout the winter months. The floor was covered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs, changed weekly, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical stories, their colors still bright despite their age. But Elinor rarely saw the great hall except in glimpses, when she carried platters of food from the kitchens, or when she was summoned to serve at the high table. Her world was the servants' quarters, the dark, cramped spaces where the castle's workforce lived and labored. The kitchen, where she spent most of her waking hours, was a separate building connected to the main keep by a covered walkway, built apart so that if it caught fire, the whole castle would not burn. It was a cavernous space, always filled with smoke and steam and the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. 3 massive hearths dominated the walls, and in winter all 3 blazed constantly, making the kitchen brutally hot despite the season. Yet even that harsh heat was preferable to the cold that waited everywhere else. The servants slept in a long, low building built against the outer wall, a structure that had been added piecemeal over generations as the castle's staff had grown. The walls were thin timber and wattle, not thick stone like the main keep, and the gaps between the boards let in needles of icy wind. There were no windows, only a few narrow slits too small for a man to fit through, designed more for ventilation than light. The floor was packed earth, damp and cold, covered with thin straw that was meant to be changed monthly, but was more often left to rot and compress under the weight of sleeping bodies. 37 people slept in that long room, ranging from children of 6 or 7 to ancient women too old for heavy work, but still useful for spinning and sewing. They slept on pallets stuffed with straw, 2 or 3 to a pallet to share warmth, under rough woolen blankets that were stiff with old sweat and grime. In the very coldest nights, when frost formed on the inside of the walls, they would pile together like animals in a den, sacrificing privacy for survival. Elinor shared her pallet with 2 other kitchen maids, Agnes and Mary, both older than her but neither more than 25. The contrast between the servants' quarters and the noble chambers was so stark it seemed they lived in different castles entirely. Lord Edmund of Ashenmore, the master of the castle, occupied a suite of rooms in the southern tower, where thick walls held warmth and large glazed windows let in light without admitting cold. His floors were covered with thick carpets brought from the east at ruinous expense, and his bed was a massive affair of carved oak hung with heavy curtains lined with fur. He had a private chapel, a wardrobe with a privy that emptied into the sea far below, and a brazier that burned day and night, fed by servants who crept in silently to add coals. Lord Edmund was 42 years old that winter, a tall man running to fat, with thinning gray hair and a face reddened by good wine and rich food. He had inherited the castle and its lands from his father 20 years earlier, and he ruled them with the casual cruelty of a man who had never known want. He was not deliberately evil, not the sort of lord who took pleasure in others' suffering. He simply did not think about his servants much at all, any more than he thought about the horses in his stable or the hawks in his mews. They were part of the castle's machinery, necessary but beneath notice. His wife, Lady Beatrice, was younger, perhaps 30, a delicate blonde woman with pale skin and nervous hands. She had been married to Lord Edmund when she was 15, brought from a southern estate to seal an alliance between families. She had borne him 4 children, though only 2 had survived past infancy, a son of 12 named Richard and a daughter of 9 named Constance. She spent her days in her solar, a bright room in the eastern tower, where she and her ladies-in-waiting did embroidery and played music and gossiped about the affairs of distant courts. She had never been in the servants' quarters, had never walked through the muddy ward where the workers lived. Why would she? That was not her world. The winter of 1347 was particularly brutal. The first snow fell in early November, and by December the ground was frozen solid, covered by drifts that reached past a man's knees. The North Sea churned gray and violent, sending spray so high it froze on the castle's outer walls, coating them in layers of ice that glittered in the weak winter sun. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones and sinew, making every breath an effort and every movement painful. For the nobles, winter meant retreating into warmth and comfort. The great hall became the center of their lives, where they gathered for elaborate meals that lasted for hours. Elinor would stand against the wall, waiting to refill cups or bring fresh platters, and she would watch them eat with a fascination that bordered on horror. Such quantities of food, more at a single meal than her family had seen in a month when she was a child. Whole roasted swans, their feathers carefully preserved and replaced after cooking, so they seemed to sleep on golden platters. Pies the size of cartwheels filled with venison and boar. Jellies molded into fantastic shapes, castles and ships and prancing horses. Fruits preserved in honey, imported at vast expense from orchards far to the south. White bread, soft and fine, slathered with butter churned fresh that morning. The nobles ate with their fingers, tearing at meat and dipping bread into rich gravies, laughing and shouting over the noise of dogs fighting for scraps beneath the tables. They drank wine from silver cups, deep red wine brought up from the cellars, where hundreds of barrels lay aging in the dark. Sometimes Lord Edmund would call for musicians, and they would play while he and his guests danced, their fine clothes swirling in the firelight, their faces flushed with wine and warmth and satisfaction. For the servants, winter meant something entirely different. It meant hunger, always hunger, a gnawing emptiness that never quite went away. They were fed, of course. Lord Edmund was not so cruel as to let his workers starve outright. But the food they received was minimal, designed to keep them alive and working, nothing more. Twice a day, morning and evening, they were given their rations. In the morning it was pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever grains were cheapest, oats usually, boiled until they fell apart and flavored with a bit of onion or turnip if they were lucky. Sometimes there would be a piece of hard black bread, coarse stuff made from rye mixed with whatever other grains or legumes happened to be available, mixed often with ground peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The evening meal was similar, sometimes with a bit of dried fish thrown in, or on feast days a scrap of salted pork. They never saw the fine white bread or the roasted meats, never tasted the wine or the sweet pastries. Those were for the nobles and their guests, for people who mattered. The servants drank small beer, weak stuff barely alcoholic, or water drawn from the well in the ward, water that often tasted of earth and sometimes of worse things. Elinor had learned long ago not to think too much about the difference. It would drive you mad to stand in the great hall serving food you would never taste, watching nobles leave half-eaten platters that would go to the dogs while your own stomach cramped with hunger. You learned to wall off that part of your mind, to think of the nobles almost as a different species of creature, something that existed in a separate reality from your own. It was the only way to bear it. But this winter was worse than usual. The harvest had been poor, damaged by too much rain in the late summer, and the stores were lower than they should be. Lord Edmund's steward, a cold-eyed man named Walter who managed the castle's provisions, had reduced the servants' rations. The pottage was thinner, more water and less grain. The bread portions smaller. "We must be careful," he announced in his flat voice. "The winter will be long, and we must make our supplies last until spring." Of course, the nobles' meals remained as lavish as ever. Lord Edmund did not reduce his consumption, did not tell his guests that they should make do with less. The winter might be hard, but not for them, never for them. Elinor first noticed the changes in Agnes. Agnes was 23, a sturdy girl with strong arms and a ready laugh, or at least she had been. By late December, the laugh had disappeared. Agnes had always been the one who kept spirits up, who would hum songs while they worked and tell stories to pass the endless hours. But now she was quiet, her face drawn, her eyes hollow. She moved more slowly, tired all the time, needing to rest frequently. "I'm fine," she would say when Elinor asked, but she wasn't fine. None of them were fine. Mary was even worse. Mary was the oldest of the three who shared a pallet, 25 and worn down by years of hard labor. She had come to the castle as a young girl like Elinor, but she had been here longer, had seen more winters. She had a cough that had started in November and never quite went away, a deep rattling sound that shook her thin frame. At night, lying pressed together for warmth, Elinor could feel Mary's body burning with fever, could hear her breathing, shallow and rapid. "You should see the infirmarian," Elinor urged her one night, speaking quietly so as not to wake the others around them. "And what would Brother Thomas do?" Mary asked, her voice hoarse. "Give me some herbs. Tell me to rest." She laughed bitterly, which turned into a coughing fit that left her gasping. "There is no rest. You know that. We work or we're turned out, and being turned out in winter is death anyway. At least here there's a roof and some food, thin as it is." She was right, and Elinor knew it. The castle's infirmarian, a monk who served as physician to the household, had a small chamber where he tended to the sick and injured. But his attention, like everything else in the castle, was divided by rank. If Lord Edmund had a headache, Brother Thomas would rush to his side with remedies and concern. If Lady Beatrice felt faint, he would be there instantly with restoratives and advice. But for the servants, there was little he could or would do. A few herbs if you were lucky, some barley water for fever, but mostly just the advice to rest, advice that was impossible to follow. The kitchen work was endless and brutal, even more so in winter when the nobles stayed inside and demanded constant entertainment and food. Elinor's days began in darkness, hours before dawn, when she would drag herself from her pallet and stumble through the freezing darkness to the kitchen. Her fingers would be numb and clumsy as she built up the fires, coaxing flames from embers that had been banked overnight. Then there was water to haul from the well, heavy buckets that left her arms aching. There was grain to grind for bread, dough to knead, vegetables to chop, meat to prepare. The head cook was a massive woman named Marjorie, who ruled the kitchen with absolute authority, and a wooden spoon she was not afraid to use on anyone who displeased her. She had been at Ashenmore for 30 years, had started as a scullery maid, and worked her way up through sheer competence and force of will. She was hard but not unkind, and she did her best to protect her workers from the worst of the nobles' demands. "Keep your head down and work fast," she would tell the younger servants. "Don't let them see you're there. You're not a person to them, you're a pair of hands, and that's how you stay safe." Elinor had learned that lesson well. When she served in the great hall, she kept her eyes downcast, moved quietly and efficiently, anticipated needs before they were voiced. She became invisible, just another servant indistinguishable from all the others. It was a skill that took years to perfect, this art of being present but unseen. But even invisibility couldn't protect them from the cold. That was the enemy that winter, more than hunger, more than exhaustion. The cold that crept into the servants' quarters at night, that made the thin walls seem like no protection at all. They would huddle together, sharing body heat, but it was never enough. Elinor would lie awake, feeling Mary's feverish heat on one side and Agnes's shivering on the other, listening to the wind howl and feeling the cold seep up from the frozen ground beneath them. People began to fall ill. Old Marjorie, who had tended the herb garden for 40 years, developed a pain in her chest that made breathing difficult. Young Tom, a boy of 8 who worked in the stables, came down with a fever that left him delirious, calling for a mother who had died when he was born. Sarah, who worked in the laundry, slipped on the ice in the ward and broke her arm, and when it was set by Brother Thomas, it healed crookedly, leaving her unable to do heavy work. And still the nobles feasted. Every night, sometimes twice a day, the great hall would fill with warmth and light and laughter, and the servants would carry platter after platter of food from the sweltering kitchen through the freezing walkway to the hall. The shock of going from heat to cold and back again was almost worse than the cold alone. Elinor's hands would crack and bleed from the constant changes in temperature, her skin unable to adapt quickly enough. One night in early January, Elinor was serving at a particularly lavish feast. Lord Edmund had guests, nobles from neighboring estates who had made the dangerous winter journey for some political negotiation that Elinor neither understood nor cared about. The great hall was blazing with light, candles everywhere, the huge fireplace roaring, braziers set up around the room adding their warmth. The nobles had stripped down to light clothing, complaining of the heat, calling for more wine to cool their throats. Elinor stood against the wall in her thin wool dress, holding a pitcher of wine, waiting to refill cups. She could feel sweat trickling down her back from the heat, but her feet were still numb with cold from the walk through the covered passage. She watched Lord Edmund laugh at some jest, his face red and shining, his hand reaching for another piece of meat. Beside him, Lady Beatrice picked delicately at a dish of candied fruits, her expression bored. "More wine," Lord Edmund bellowed, and Elinor stepped forward quickly, silent and efficient. She refilled his cup, the heavy silver goblet carved with scenes of hunting, and started to step back. But Lord Edmund's hand moved unexpectedly, knocking against the pitcher. Wine sloshed over the rim, a few drops landing on his velvet sleeve. For a moment, everything stopped. Lord Edmund looked down at the dark spots on his sleeve, and his face darkened. "Clumsy fool," he snapped, and backhanded Elinor across the face. The blow wasn't particularly hard. He was drunk and uncoordinated. But it caught her by surprise, and she stumbled, nearly dropping the pitcher. Her cheek burned where his rings had scraped the skin. The other nobles barely looked up, their conversation continuing as if nothing had happened. To them, it was nothing, just a servant being corrected. "Get out," Lord Edmund said, already forgetting her, turning back to his guests. "Send someone who knows how to pour properly." Elinor fled, her face burning with more than pain. In the kitchen, Marjorie took one look at her and sent her to fetch something from the cellar, a make-work task to give her time to compose herself. Elinor stood in the cool darkness among the barrels and sacks, touching her cheek gently, feeling where the skin had split. It wasn't the first time she'd been struck. Servants were hit regularly, for real mistakes or imagined ones, or sometimes just because a noble was in a bad mood. But something about tonight made it harder to bear. She thought about the food she had served, enough to feed a village for a week, and the thin pottage waiting for her after the feast was over. She thought about Lord Edmund's warm chambers and the freezing servants' quarters. She thought about Mary's cough and Agnes's hollow eyes and old Marjorie's labored breathing. And she thought about the nobles laughing and eating and never, not once, thinking about the people who made their comfort possible. It wasn't fair. She knew that was a childish thought, that fairness had nothing to do with how the world worked. She knew that the order of society was ordained by God, that nobles were nobles and servants were servants, and that was simply how things were. The priest said so every Sunday, preaching that each person had their place and should be content in it, that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. But standing in that dark cellar, her cheek throbbing, her stomach empty, the cold seeping into her bones, Elinor found she didn't care what the priest said. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Agnes collapsed on the floor near one of the hearths. She had simply crumpled in the middle of carrying a heavy pot, her legs giving out beneath her. Two other servants had dragged her to the side, out of the way of the work that had to continue. Agnes was conscious but dazed, her skin gray, her breathing shallow. "She hasn't eaten today," one of the other maids whispered to Elinor. "She gave her breakfast to her little brother, the boy who works in the mews. He was so hungry," she said, "and he's only 9. She thought she could manage. Marjorie, the head cook, appeared with a cup of broth and made Agnes drink it, supporting her head with surprising gentleness. "Foolish girl," she muttered, but there was no real anger in her voice, only a weary sadness. "You can't save everyone. You have to take care of yourself first." But that was the thing. None of them could really take care of themselves, not on the rations they were given. They were all slowly starving, just slowly enough that they could still work, still serve, still make the nobles' lives comfortable. It was a careful calculation, Elinor realized. Feed the servants just enough to keep them alive and working, but not enough to make them comfortable, not enough to make them strong and healthy. Because strong, healthy servants might start to think they deserved better, might start to question why they should suffer while others feasted. That night back in the servants' quarters, the cold was brutal. The wind had picked up, screaming around the castle walls, and snow was falling so thickly you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The thin walls of the servants' building shuddered with each gust, and frost formed intricate patterns on the inside of the boards, beautiful and deadly. Elinor huddled between Agnes, who had recovered enough to walk back under her own power, and Mary, whose cough seemed worse than ever. In the darkness, someone started to cry muffled sobs that they tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. It was one of the younger servants, Elinor thought, maybe 10 or 11 years old, young enough to still hope things might get better, young enough to not yet have learned to wall off the part of themselves that felt pain. Others shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. What comfort could they offer? They were all suffering, all cold and hungry and exhausted. Mary's cough grew worse as the night went on, great racking spasms that shook her whole body. Elinor held her, feeling how thin she had become, feeling the fever that burned through her skin. In the morning, Mary couldn't get up. She tried, struggling to sit up when the bell rang for work, but her body wouldn't obey. She fell back onto the pallet, gasping. "Go on," she whispered to Elinor. "You'll be late." "I'll come when I can." But they both knew she wouldn't. Elinor went to Marjorie, explained that Mary was too sick to work. Marjorie's face tightened, but she nodded. "She can rest today. But if she's not better by tomorrow, we'll have to tell the steward." "You know the rules." Elinor knew the rules. A servant too sick to work was a servant who wasn't earning their keep. They would be turned out, sent away from the castle to make room for someone healthy, someone useful. In summer, that might mean a chance to recover, to make your way to family or to another household. In winter, in a storm like this, it was a death sentence. But the castle couldn't afford to feed those who couldn't work. Resources were limited even for servants, especially for servants. Elinor worked through that day in a fog of fear and exhaustion. Every time she had a spare moment, she would slip back to the servants' quarters to check on Mary, bringing whatever scraps she could steal from the kitchen. A crust of bread here, a bit of cheese that had been overlooked, once even a small piece of cooked meat that had fallen on the floor and been deemed unfit for the noble's table. Mary tried to eat, but the food seemed to stick in her throat, and the coughing would start again, worse than before. By evening, Mary's fever had climbed higher. Her skin was burning to the touch, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She muttered to herself, words that made no sense, fragments of memory and delirium mixed together. Elinor sat beside her during the brief time between the evening meal service and sleep, holding her hand, feeling helpless. Around them, the other servants prepared for bed, most of them too tired to do more than collapse onto their pallets. A few cast worried glances at Mary, but no one said anything. They all knew what was coming. Agnes knelt on Mary's other side, her own face drawn and pale. "We should get Brother Thomas," she said quietly. "What good would it do? Elinor replied, but even as she said it, she was standing up. Stay with her. I'll go. The infirmary was in a small building attached to the chapel, a single room with a narrow bed, a table covered with jars and bundles of herbs, and a brazier that provided a meager warmth. Brother Thomas was there, an elderly monk with a fringe of white hair around his tonsured head and rheumy eyes that had seen too much suffering. He looked up when Elinor entered, unsurprised. There was always someone sick, especially in winter. It's Mary from the kitchen, Elinor said, the words tumbling out. She's very ill, brother. Fever and cough, and she can't get warm no matter how many blankets we pile on her. Please, can you come? Brother Thomas sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. I'll come, he said, gathering a few items into a leather bag. But child, you must understand, there's little I can do. If it's the lung fever as it sounds, then it's in God's hands now. They walked together through the darkness, snow stinging their faces. The servants' quarters were dim, lit only by a few smoking tallow candles. The smell hit Brother Thomas as soon as he entered. Too many unwashed bodies in too small a space, sickness and damp straw and despair. He made his way to Mary's pallet, kneeling beside her with difficulty, his old knees creaking. He examined her with gentle hands, feeling her forehead, listening to her breathing, looking at her eyes and tongue. Finally, he sat back on his heels, his expression grave. Lung fever, he confirmed. Advanced. I can give her something to ease the cough, to help her sleep, but beyond that, he spread his hands helplessly. She needs warmth, rest, good food, time to heal. Barley water with honey, chicken broth, a warm room with a fire. Without those things, I cannot promise she'll recover. Can she be moved to the infirmary? Elinor asked, though she already knew the answer. The infirmary is currently occupied, Brother Thomas said carefully. Lord Edmund's falconer was injured 3 days ago when one of the birds struck him. He's recovering there. And Lady Beatrice's maid has a fever as well, though a mild one. She's in the second bed. There's no room for, he trailed off, unable to quite say it. No room for a kitchen servant, no room for someone unimportant. The falconer was valuable, skilled labor that took years to train. Lady Beatrice's maid served someone who mattered. But Mary was just one of many kitchen workers, easily replaced. That was what Brother Thomas couldn't bring himself to say, but Elinor heard it anyway in his silence. Brother Thomas mixed something from his bag, herbs in a small amount of wine, and helped Mary drink it. The coughing eased somewhat, and Mary's breathing grew more regular as she slipped into a drugged sleep. Keep her warm as best you can, he told Elinor. Give her water when she wakes, small sips. If she improves by tomorrow, come find me. If she worsens, again that helpless spreading of hands. After he left, Elinor and Agnes did what they could. They piled every spare blanket they could find onto Mary, begged 2 more from other servants who gave them reluctantly. They took turns sitting with her through the night, one sleeping while the other kept watch, making sure the blanket stayed in place, giving her sips of water when she stirred. But in the deepest part of the night, when the cold was at its worst and the wind howled like something alive and hungry, Mary began to struggle for breath. Her chest heaved with the effort, each inhalation a battle, each exhalation a rattling wheeze. Elinor held her hand, whispering useless comfort, feeling Mary's grip weaken. Agnes had gone to get help, but Elinor knew it was too late. She had seen this before, seen people slip away in the night, and she recognized the signs. Mary opened her eyes, and for a moment they were clear, focused. She looked at Elinor, and her cracked lips moved. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." "I know," Elinor said, tears running down her face. "I know, but you're going to be warm soon. You're going to be somewhere warm, I promise." Mary smiled just barely. "My mother," she said. "I can see my mother. She's waiting." And then her eyes went distant, looking at something Elinor couldn't see, and her breathing stopped. Elinor sat there for a long time, holding Mary's hand as it grew cold, feeling the warmth leave her body. Around them, the other servants slept on, exhausted past the point of waking. When Agnes returned with Brother Thomas, they found Elinor still sitting there, tears dried on her face, staring at nothing. "God rest her soul," Brother Thomas murmured, making the sign of the cross. "She's at peace now, beyond suffering." But Elinor found no comfort in those words. Mary hadn't needed peace in the next world. She had needed warmth and food and care in this one. She had needed to matter enough that someone would save her. But she hadn't mattered, not to the people who decided such things. She had been just another servant, and servants died all the time, especially in winter. It was expected, unremarkable. They carried Mary's body to the chapel before dawn, wrapped in the rough blanket she had died on. Brother Thomas would say prayers for her soul, and she would be buried in the servants' section of the graveyard when the ground thawed enough to dig. For now, her body would lie in the crypt, frozen like everything else, waiting for spring. By morning, another girl had been brought up from the village to take her place in the kitchen. Her name was Joan, and she was perhaps 14, thin and scared. She slept on Mary's pallet that night, in the same thin blanket, and life went on as if Mary had never existed at all. Elinor moved through the next days like a ghost herself. She worked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the weight of Mary's death, the injustice of it, the waste. She carried platters to the great hall and watched the nobles feast, and something inside her that had been merely numb before hardened into something colder and more bitter. She saw Lord Edmund laugh with his mouth full of roasted meat, saw Lady Beatrice complain that the wine wasn't properly spiced, and she hated them with a quiet intensity that frightened her. Agnes wasn't doing well either. The shock of Mary's death seemed to have broken something in her. She worked mechanically, without her former energy, and the hollowness in her eyes deepened. She ate less than ever, and when Elinor tried to make her take more food, she would just shake her head. "What's the point?" she asked once. "We're all going to end up like Mary eventually. What's the point of fighting it?" "The point is to survive," Elinor said fiercely. "The point is to live." Why? Agnes asked simply. So we can work ourselves to death a little more slowly. So we can serve them a few more years before we collapse. What kind of life is that? Elinor had no answer. She lay awake at night, now pressed against the new girl Joan on one side and Agnes on the other, and wondered the same thing. What were they surviving for? What future did they have? They would work until their bodies gave out, and then they would die, unmourned and unremarked, and other girls would take their places. That was the cycle, generation after generation. Some might survive long enough to become like old Marjorie or the head cook, authorities in their small domain, but most wouldn't. Most would die young, worn out by labor and hunger and cold. In the great hall, the nobles celebrated Epiphany with a feast that lasted for 3 days. There were mummers and musicians, acrobats and jugglers, entertainment brought in at great expense from London. The tables groaned under the weight of food, and the wine flowed like water. Lord Edmund presided over it all with evident satisfaction, his face ruddy with drink, his laughter booming through the hall. Elinor served mechanically, her face a blank mask, her movements efficient. She had perfected the art of invisibility now. She could move through the room like a shadow, anticipating needs, refilling cups, removing empty platters, all without attracting notice. It was what she had been trained to do, but now it felt like more than just a skill. It felt like a kind of death, a way of erasing herself so completely that she ceased to exist as a person. On the second night of the Epiphany feast, she was standing against the wall holding a pitcher of wine when she heard Lord Edmund's voice rise above the general noise. He was telling a story about the winter, about the cold, and he was laughing. "My wife complains constantly," he said, his words slightly slurred. "She says the solar is too cold, that she can see her breath in the mornings. Can you imagine? I told her, my dear, you have 3 braziers and a fire and enough furs to bury yourself in. What more do you want?" But women are never satisfied. The other nobles laughed appreciatively. One of them, a visiting lord from the south, said, "At least your servants don't complain. Mine are always whining about something, the cold, the food, the work. As if they weren't lucky to have positions at all." "Oh, servants always complain," Lord Edmund said dismissively. "It's their nature. But they're hardy folk, used to hardship. The cold doesn't bother them like it does us. They're bred for it really, like oxen or donkeys." More laughter. Elinor stood there, pitcher in hand, and felt something inside her break. The cold didn't bother them. Bred for it like oxen. She thought of Mary, struggling for breath in the frozen darkness. She thought of old Marjorie, her chest tight with pain. She thought of the children who slept in the servants' quarters, shivering under inadequate blankets, their growth stunted by malnutrition. The cold didn't bother them. It took every ounce of control she possessed not to throw the pitcher of wine in Lord Edmund's laughing face. Her hands shook with the effort of staying still, of remaining invisible. She wanted to scream at them, to make them see what they refused to see, to make them understand that she was a person who felt cold and hunger and pain just as they did. But she couldn't. She was nothing, nobody, just a servant. Her voice didn't matter. Later in the kitchen, she found Marjorie the cook sitting by one of the hearths, staring into the flames. The kitchen was quiet now, the work finished. The nobles finally sated and retired to their chambers. Marjorie looked up as Elinor approached, and something in Elinor's face must have shone, because the older woman patted the bench beside her. "Sit, child," she said. "You look ready to do murder." Elinor sat, and the words came pouring out. What Lord Edmund had said, how he had laughed, the casual cruelty of it. Marjorie listened without interrupting, her weathered face expressionless in the firelight. When Elinor finished, Marjorie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It's always been this way. I've been here 30 years, and my mother was here before me, and her mother before her. The nobles feast and the servants starve, and that's just how the world is. You can rage against it all you want, but it won't change anything." "It isn't right," Elinor said. "No," Marjorie agreed. "It isn't right. But right doesn't matter much to people like us. We're born to serve, and we die serving, and that's our lot. The priests tell us to accept it, that we'll be rewarded in heaven for our suffering on earth. Maybe they're right. God knows this life offers us little enough. I don't want to wait for heaven," Elinor said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I don't know what I want. Justice, fairness. For them to see us as people, not animals." Marjorie turned to look at her fully, and there was something old and sad in her eyes. "Be careful, girl. That kind of thinking is dangerous. You start believing you deserve better. You start forgetting your place, and that's when you get hurt. Or worse. I've seen it happen. Servants who spoke up, who complained, who thought they had rights. They don't last long. So we just accept it. Just keep our heads down and suffer in silence." "We survive," Marjorie said. "That's all we can do. We survive, and we take care of each other as best we can, and we get through one day at a time. It's not much of a life, but it's the only one we have." Elinor wanted to argue, to say that there had to be more than just survival, but she couldn't find the words. Maybe Marjorie was right. Maybe acceptance was the only way to bear it. But something in her rebelled against that idea, refused to surrender completely. There had to be a reason they were here, something beyond just serving people who thought of them as less than human. The next morning, Agnes didn't wake up. Elinor shook her gently at first, then more urgently, but Agnes didn't respond. Her skin was cold to the touch, colder even than the freezing air around them, and when Elinor pressed her ear to Agnes's chest, she couldn't hear a heartbeat. Agnes had died sometime in the night, slipped away as quietly as she had lived, too tired and hungry and cold to go on. This death hit Elinor even harder than Mary's. Mary had been sick, visibly failing, but Agnes had been walking around, working just the day before. She had seemed tired, but no more so than any of them. That she could simply die, her body giving out without warning, was terrifying. It meant any of them could be next. It meant there was no safety, no predictability. You could go to sleep and never wake up, and no one would particularly care. They carried Agnes to the chapel, another body for the crypt, another empty space filled by a new servant from the village. The castle needed workers, after all, and there were always desperate people willing to take positions, no matter how harsh the conditions. Food and shelter, even inadequate food and inadequate shelter, was better than nothing when you were starving in a hovel with no fuel for fire. Brother Thomas said prayers for Agnes, just as he had for Mary, but his voice seemed to have less conviction now. He looked tired, Elinor thought, tired and old. How many servants had he prayed over in his years at Ashenmore? How many bodies had he blessed and sent to unmarked graves? Did it weigh on him, or had he become as numb as the rest of them? The nobles didn't notice, of course. Why would they? The service in the great hall continued without interruption. Food appeared when they wanted it, their clothes were washed and mended, their chambers kept warm. The machinery of the castle operated smoothly, and if a few cogs broke and had to be replaced, well, that was just the natural order of things. Servants died, it happened. There were always more servants, but Elinor noticed. She noticed how many empty places appeared at meals, how many new faces showed up in the servants' quarters. She started counting, keeping track in her head because she couldn't write and had no paper anyway. In January alone, 6 servants died. 6 people who had been alive at the beginning of the month, who had had names and histories and hopes, however small. Mary Agnes, old Marjorie from the herb garden, Tom the stable boy, Sarah from the laundry who had broken her arm, and a man named Will who worked in the blacksmith's forge, who had simply collapsed one day while hauling coal and never gotten up again. 6 deaths in 1 month, and winter wasn't even half over. February stretched ahead, the cruelest month, when the supplies were lowest and the cold deepest. How many more would die before spring? How many more would be ground down and used up and discarded? One evening in late January, Elinor found herself in a part of the castle she didn't usually visit. She had been sent to deliver a message to one of the upper servants, the chamberlain who managed Lord Edmund's personal quarters, and she had gotten turned around in the maze of corridors. The nobles section of the castle was warmer than she had ever imagined. Thick carpets covered the floors, tapestries hung on the walls, and braziers burned at regular intervals. She could feel the heat radiating from them, a luxurious warmth that seemed almost sinful in its abundance. She found herself outside Lord Edmund's chambers. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear voices inside, Lord Edmund and Lady Beatrice talking. She knew she should leave immediately, that listening to the nobles' private conversations was grounds for severe punishment. But something made her pause, made her listen. "The stores are lower than I'd like," Lord Edmund was saying. "Walter tells me we'll need to be careful if we want to make it to the harvest. Then we should reduce the servants' rations further," Lady Beatrice replied, her voice practical and unconcerned. "They're getting too much as it is. I saw one of the kitchen maids the other day, and she looked perfectly healthy. If they can work, they're eating enough." "Perhaps you're right," Lord Edmund said. "I'll speak to Walter about it. We can afford to cut back on the bread, certainly. The servants don't need as much food as we do. They're not doing work that requires thought, after all, just physical labor. Anyone can do that." Elinor stood frozen, listening to them discuss reducing the rations that were already starvation level, talking about it as casually as they might discuss the weather. They didn't know that servants were dying. Or if they knew, they didn't care. To them, it was just a matter of efficient resource management, no different than deciding how much hay to feed the horses. She finally forced herself to move, to turn and walk away before she was discovered. But their words echoed in her head. "They're getting too much. Anyone can do that." As if the work that kept the castle running, that kept them warm and fed and comfortable, was nothing. As if the people who did that work were nothing. Back in the servants' quarters that night, Elinor lay awake long after the others had fallen into exhausted sleep. The new girl, Joan, was pressed against her side, whimpering softly in her sleep. On her other side was another new servant, a boy named Peter who had arrived just that afternoon to replace Will, the blacksmith's assistant. He was perhaps 16, and he had cried when he first saw the servants' quarters, though he had tried to hide it. Elinor thought about what Marjorie had said, about survival being all they could hope for. She thought about Lord Edmund's casual cruelty, Lady Beatrice's cold practicality. She thought about Mary and Agnes, about the 6 people who had died in January, about all the people who had died in winters past, and all those who would die in winters to come. And she thought about fairness, justice, those abstract concepts that seemed to have no place in the world she inhabited. Was Marjorie right? Was acceptance the only option? Should she just focus on surviving, on getting through one day at a time, and not think about the larger injustice of it all? It would certainly be easier. Anger was exhausting, and she was already so tired. It would be a relief to let it go, to accept her place in the order of things. But she couldn't. Something in her, some stubborn core of self that refused to be erased, wouldn't let her. She was a person, not an animal, not a tool. She felt cold and hunger and pain. She had loved Mary and Agnes, mourned their deaths, feared her own. Those feelings mattered, even if no one else acknowledged them. Her life mattered, even if it seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of the castle's operation. She wasn't sure what to do with these thoughts, these dangerous feelings of rebellion. She couldn't change anything. One servant, one girl with no power or influence or voice, couldn't alter the fundamental structure of society. But maybe, she thought, maybe she could at least bear witness. Maybe she could remember, could hold on to the truth of what was happening even if everyone else chose to ignore it. Mary had existed. Agnes had existed. They had been real people with real lives, and they had mattered, even if only to the few who had known them. Their deaths had been wrong, unnecessary, the result of cruelty and indifference. And Elinor would remember that. She would carry their memory, and the memory of all the others who died forgotten and unmourned. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a small act of defiance against the forces that wanted to treat them as disposable. The wind howled around the castle walls, and snow continued to fall, and the long winter stretched ahead with no end in sight. But Elinor closed her eyes and held onto that small flame of defiance, that refusal to forget. Tomorrow she would get up and work and serve and pretend to be invisible. But inside, where the nobles couldn't see, she would remain herself. She would remain human, and somehow that felt like a victory, however small. February arrived with no relief from the cold. If anything, the weather worsened. Blizzards swept in from the North Sea with such ferocity that even the nobles complained, though their complaints were accompanied by calls for more firewood, more braziers, more heated wine. The servants who had to venture outside to fetch wood or water or tend to animals came back with faces raw and bleeding from the wind, their fingers and toes blackened with frostbite. Elinor learned to wrap her hands in rags before going outside, learned to keep moving no matter how much her body screamed for rest, because to stop moving was to invite the cold to settle into your bones. She watched the other servants, trying to gauge who was weakening, who might be next. It became a grim game of prediction, though she took no pleasure in being right. There was young Joan, the girl who had taken Mary's place, already developing a persistent cough. There was Edmund the swineherd, an elderly man whose joints had begun to swell and stiffen until he could barely walk. There was Catherine, one of the chambermaids, who had lost so much weight that her clothes hung on her like sacks. The promised reduction in rations came at the start of February. Walter, the steward, announced it with his usual flat affect, as if he were discussing nothing more significant than a change in the schedule. The morning pottage would be served in smaller portions, and the bread ration cut by a third. "We must preserve our stores," he said. "Lord Edmund has been generous, but we must all make sacrifices in these difficult times." Sacrifices. The word rang hollow. The nobles weren't making sacrifices. Their meals remained as elaborate as ever. Just the previous evening, Elinor had served at a feast where a whole roasted boar had been presented with such ceremony you would think it was a sacred relic. The boar's head had been decorated with gilded apples in its mouth, herbs woven into a crown, its skin glazed with honey until it gleamed. Lord Edmund had carved it himself, laughing as he distributed portions to his guests, the meat falling away in rich, fatty slabs that made Elinor's mouth water despite herself. After the announcement about rations, the servants returned to work in silence. What could they say? Protest would accomplish nothing except to mark you as a troublemaker, and troublemakers didn't last long. You either accepted what you were given or you left, and leaving in February was suicide. So they accepted it because there was no other choice. But acceptance didn't mean the hunger stopped. With less food, the servants grew weaker faster. The work didn't decrease to match their diminished strength. If anything, it seemed to increase. The nobles wanted more fires kept burning, more hot food brought more frequently, more laundry done because they were changing clothes more often in an effort to stay warm. And the servants had to meet these demands with bodies that were slowly consuming themselves, burning muscle and fat that they couldn't afford to lose. Elinor felt herself growing lighter, her dresses becoming looser around the waist. When she looked at her arms, she could see every tendon, every bone. Her face, glimpsed in the reflection of a copper pot she was scrubbing, looked gaunt and angular, her cheekbones too prominent, her eyes too large. She was disappearing, she thought sometimes. Fading away like morning mist. The kitchen, once unbearably hot, now felt merely warm. Elinor realized with a kind of distant horror that her body had so little fuel that even the blazing hearths couldn't make her sweat anymore. She would stand close to the flames, trying to absorb heat like a lizard on a rock, but it never seemed to penetrate deep enough. The cold lived inside her now, had taken up residence in her core. Young Joan collapsed one morning while carrying a bucket of water. The bucket fell, water sloshing across the frozen ground of the ward, and Joan went down with it. Elinor and another maid ran to help her up, but Joan's legs wouldn't hold her weight. Her eyes were unfocused, her speech slurred. They half carried her back to the kitchen, where Marjorie the cook took one look at her and sent for Brother Thomas. Starvation, Brother Thomas said quietly when he examined Joan. Her body is eating itself. She needs food, real food, meat and bread and cheese. She needs rest. Can she go to the infirmary? Elinor asked, though she knew the answer. Brother Thomas shook his head. The infirmary is full. Lady Beatrice's youngest daughter has a cough, and she's taken the main bed. Her nursemaid is there attending her. And Lord Edmund's clerk has gout. He's in the second bed. There's no room. Then what happens to her? She rests here as best she can, Brother Thomas said. I'll leave some herbs, but honestly, child, what she needs is food, and that I cannot provide. He paused, looking at Elinor with something like pity in his old eyes. You should prepare yourself. She won't recover without nourishment, and there's none to give her. They made a pallet for Joan near one of the kitchen hearths, where at least she would be warm. Marjorie allowed it because Joan was so small and quiet that she wasn't really in the way, and because Marjorie, for all her gruff exterior, was not heartless. Joan lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, while the kitchen work continued around her. Sometimes she would whisper for her mother, or for water, which they would give her in small sips. But mostly she just lay still, her breathing shallow, her skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality. Elinor tried to give Joan some of her own food, pressing bits of bread into the girl's mouth when no one was looking. But Joan could barely swallow, and Elinor herself was so weak that giving away food felt like tearing off pieces of her own flesh. Still, she tried. Joan was 14, just a child really, and she had come to the castle hoping for something better than the poverty of her village. Instead, she was dying on a pallet by a kitchen hearth, unmourned by anyone except the other servants who knew they might be next. On the third day after Joan's collapse, Lord Edmund hosted another feast. This one was in honor of Candlemas, the feast of the purification of Mary, a religious holiday that had become an excuse for excess. The chapel service was brief, just long enough for the nobles to feel they had fulfilled their spiritual obligations, and then they retired to the great hall for the real celebration. The feast was extraordinary, even by Ashenmoor's lavish standards. There were swans and herons and peacocks, their plumage carefully preserved so the birds could be presented in full display. There were pies containing smaller birds, so that when you cut into the crust, live sparrows would fly out, much to the delight of the noble children. There were subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of sugar and marzipan, depicting biblical scenes and heraldic beasts. There were jellies molded into the shapes of castles and ships. There were fruits preserved in syrup, nuts candied in honey, cheeses from France, dried figs from the south. And there was so much waste. Lord Edmund's dogs fought over scraps thrown casually from the table. Whole platters of food were barely touched before being sent back to the kitchen, the nobles having tired of that particular dish and wanting to try something else. A pie that had taken hours to prepare was dismissed because the crust was too thick. A roasted capon was rejected because it wasn't seasoned to Lady Beatrice's liking. Elinor stood against the wall, holding a pitcher of wine, watching all of this with a kind of numb detachment. She had moved beyond anger into something else, a state of mind that she couldn't quite name. It was as if she were watching from a great distance, observing but not quite present. The noble's laughter sounded tinny and false to her ears. Their fine clothes seemed like costumes, their gestures like those of actors in a play. They weren't quite real to her anymore, these people who lived in a world so divorced from her own that they might as well be different species. Lord Edmund was particularly jovial, his face flushed with wine and firelight. He stood at one point to propose a toast, his cup held high. "To God's bounty," he declared, "which provides for us so generously even in these difficult times. We are blessed indeed." The other nobles raised their cups, echoing his words. "Blessed, generous." Elinor felt something twist in her chest. In the kitchen, Joan lay dying. In the servants' quarters, people shivered under inadequate blankets. In the graveyard, 6 fresh graves waited for spring thaw. But the nobles felt blessed, felt that God's bounty was evident in their overflowing plates. She wondered what would happen if she spoke, if she stepped forward and told them about Joan, about Mary and Agnes, about all the servants who had died so that they could feast in comfort. Would they care? Would it change anything? Or would they simply have her removed, punished for insolence, replaced by another silent servant who knew her place? She didn't speak, of course. The moment passed, as all moments do, and the feast continued. The nobles ate until they could eat no more, and then they called for more wine to help them digest so they could eat again. It was obscene, Elinor thought, this deliberate excess while others starved. But it was also normal, expected, the way things had always been. The nobles' right to feast, was as unquestioned as the servant's duty to serve. Later in the kitchen, Marjorie was supervising the cleaning up. The work seemed endless. Platters to scrub, pots to scour, floors to sweep, hearths to bank for the night. The servants moved slowly, their exhaustion evident in every gesture. Elinor worked mechanically, her hands red and raw from hot water, her back aching from hours of standing. She was scraping leftover food into a bucket for the pigs when she noticed how much there was. Half a roasted chicken, barely touched. A quarter of a pie. Bread, good white bread, with only one corner torn off. A cheese meat. Food that could have fed the servants for days, enough to perhaps save Joan's life, and it was going to the pigs. "Marjorie," she said quietly, "couldn't we?" "No," Marjorie cut her off, not even needing to hear the question. "Don't even think it. That food is accounted for. Walter checks the waste. If it doesn't go to the pigs, if there's anything missing, we'll be accused of theft. And theft of the Lord's food is a hanging offense." "But Joan is dying," Elinor said. "That food could save her." "And if we're caught, we'd be hanged," Marjorie replied, her voice hard. "And what good would that do anyone? Joan would still die, and we'd be dead too. I'm sorry, girl, but that's the way it is. We can't save everyone. We can barely save ourselves." Elinor looked at the bucket of scraps, worth more than the combined weekly rations of all the servants, destined for pigs who were better fed than the humans who tended them. The injustice of it was so stark, so obvious, that she couldn't understand how everyone just accepted it. But they did, they had to. Because questioning the system was dangerous, and survival required accepting your place within it. That night, Joan died. She had been unconscious for most of the day, her breathing growing more and more shallow. Elinor sat with her during her brief break between the evening meal service and sleep, holding the girl's thin hand. Joan never woke up, never said goodbye. She simply stopped breathing sometime around midnight, slipping away as quietly as she had lived. Elinor felt the exact moment it happened, felt Joan's hand grow slack in hers, felt the absence where life had been. She sat there for a long time looking at Joan's face, peaceful now in death. 14 years old. She had lived 14 years, worked for perhaps half of them, and died of starvation in a castle full of food. It seemed impossible, a kind of cosmic joke. But it was real as the cold that seeped through the walls, as real as the hunger that gnawed at Elinor's stomach. She thought about Joan's mother, whoever she was, in whatever village Joan had come from. Did she know her daughter was dead? Would anyone tell her? Or would Joan simply disappear, another servant who had left for the castle and never returned, her fate unknown and ultimately unimportant to those who remained? Brother Thomas came in the morning to collect the body. He looked even more weary than usual, the weight of too many deaths pressing down on his shoulders. "The 7th this month," he said quietly, more to himself than to Elinor. "How many more before spring? How many servants are there in the castle?" Elinor asked suddenly. Brother Thomas considered. "Perhaps 60 in total, if you count the stables and the gardens and the outer buildings. Why? Because I want to know how many of us will be dead by March, Elinor said, her voice flat. If we're losing 7 a month to cold and hunger, we'll lose at least that many in February. Maybe more, since the rations have been reduced. That's a quarter of the servants, Brother Thomas. A quarter of us will be dead before the snow melts. He looked at her for a long moment, his old eyes sad. What would you have me do, child? I've spoken to Lord Edmund, tried to make him understand the situation. He says the servants are receiving adequate provisions, that if they're dying it's because they're weak or sickly, not because of any failing on his part. He won't increase the rations. He says he can't afford to, that the stores must last until harvest. But he can afford another feast every week. The words burst out before Elinor could stop them. He can afford to feed his dogs better than his servants. He can afford to throw away more food in one night than we eat in a month. Careful, Brother Thomas said sharply, glancing around to make sure no one had heard. That kind of talk is dangerous. I know you're angry. I know it seems unfair. But Lord Edmund is the master here, and what he does with his resources is his decision. We cannot question it. Why not? Elinor demanded. Why can't we question it? Why do we have to just accept that some people matter and others don't? That some people deserve to feast while others starve? Because that's the order of things, Brother Thomas said, and he sounded tired, so tired. God made some people nobles and others servants, and each has their place. The nobles rule and the servants serve, and that's how it's always been. To question that order is to question God's plan itself. Maybe God's plan is wrong, Elinor said, and even as she said it, she knew she had gone too far. Brother Thomas's face went pale. That's heresy, he whispered. You must never say such things. Never even think them. The church teaches that all suffering in this world is temporary, that those who endure hardship will be rewarded in heaven. You must have faith, child. You must believe that there's a purpose to all this, even if we can't see it. But Elinor was past caring about heresy or faith or divine purpose. She looked at Joan's body, at the sharp angles of her face, the hollow spaces where flesh should have been. What's the purpose of this? She asked. What's the purpose of a child starving to death in a castle full of food? If God wants me to believe there's a reason for this, he'll have to explain it to me himself, because I can't see it. Brother Thomas made the sign of the cross, his hands shaking. I'll pray for your soul, he said. You're being tested, child, and you're in danger of failing. You must find peace, must accept your lot. He left then, taking Joan's body with him, another small burden for the crypt. Elinor returned to work, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about what Brother Thomas had said, about God's plan and accepting your lot in faith. She had been raised to believe those things, had heard them preached every Sunday in the chapel. The poor would inherit the earth, but not yet. Not in this life. In this life, You suffered and served and hoped that the next world would be better. But what if the next world was just another lie told to keep servants compliant? What if there was no heaven waiting to reward their suffering? No divine justice that would eventually set things right? What if this life was all there was, and they were wasting it serving people who saw them as less than human? These thoughts frightened her. They went against everything she had been taught, everything she had believed. But she couldn't unthink them now that they had formed. They were like seeds planted in her mind, growing despite her attempts to uproot them. The rest of February passed in a blur of cold and hunger and exhaustion. More servants died. Edmund the swineherd, whose joints had seized up until he couldn't work. Catherine the chambermaid, who had wasted away to almost nothing. A boy named Jack, who worked in the stables, only 10 years old, found frozen in a snowdrift one morning when he had gone out to feed the horses before dawn. A woman named Beatrice, the same name as the lady of the castle, though that was the only thing they shared, who had simply collapsed while carrying a load of firewood and never gotten up again. Elinor stopped counting after 12. It was too depressing, too overwhelming. Every few days another body went to the crypt. Another empty space was filled by a new servant desperate enough to take the position despite the obvious dangers. The castle was grinding through people, using them up and discarding them, an endless cycle that seemed to have no solution. The servants who survived were those who were either very lucky or very strong or very ruthless. Some, Elinor noticed, were stealing food, small amounts, carefully taken so as not to be noticed. A crust of bread pocketed when Marjorie wasn't looking. A bit of cheese that had been dropped and surreptitiously eaten. A few vegetables that were supposed to go into the soup, but somehow ended up in a servant's mouth instead. It was dangerous. If caught, the punishment would be severe. But hunger drove people to take risks they otherwise wouldn't. Elinor herself stole, though it went against everything she had been taught about honesty and virtue. She stole because the alternative was to die, and she wasn't ready to die yet. She stole scraps and crusts and anything else she could manage, and she shared them with the other servants in her quarters, passing food around in the darkness where no one could see. It became a kind of quiet rebellion, this stealing. It was the only power they had, the only way they could resist the system that was killing them. They couldn't speak out, couldn't protest, couldn't demand better treatment. But they could take what they needed to survive, could reclaim tiny portions of the abundance they produced but were denied. One night, huddled in the servants' quarters with the wind screaming outside, Elinor found herself part of a whispered conversation. It started innocently enough, with someone wondering aloud how much food had been wasted at that evening's feast. But it grew from there, voices in the darkness sharing observations, frustrations, barely suppressed rage. "I saw them throw away a whole platter of meat," one voice said. "Perfectly good meat, barely touched. Said it was too cold, too cold. And we're here freezing and starving." Lady Beatrice complained about the quality of her breakfast yesterday. Another voice added. Said the bread wasn't fresh enough, even though it had been baked that morning. She had them bring her a new loaf and threw the first one to her dogs. "My sister worked at a castle in the south," someone else said. "She told me the Lord there at least made sure his servants had enough to eat. He said dead servants couldn't work, so it made sense to keep them healthy. But not Lord Edmund. He'd rather save a few pennies on food and just replace us when we die." "We should do something," a young male voice said, angry and desperate. "We should make them understand, make them see what they're doing to us." "What could we do?" That was Peter, the boy who had taken Will's place. "We're nothing to them. They don't care if we live or die." "We could refuse to work," the angry voice persisted. "All of us together. If we all stopped working, they'd have to listen." "They'd hang us," someone else said flatly. "Or turn us out to freeze. We have no power here. We never did." The conversation died after that, everyone retreating into their own thoughts, their own misery. But Elinor lay awake, thinking about what had been said. What if they did refuse to work? What if all the servants simply stopped, all at once? The nobles couldn't run the castle themselves. They didn't know how to cook or clean or tend animals, or do any of the 100 tasks that kept the place functioning. They were completely dependent on servant labor, even if they didn't acknowledge it. But Peter was right too. The nobles had all the power. They controlled the food, the shelter, the very right to live within the castle walls. A servant rebellion would be crushed immediately and brutally. It was a pleasant fantasy, but that's all it was. Still, the idea lingered in Elinor's mind. Not rebellion exactly, but the recognition of power. The servants did have power. It just wasn't the kind that could be easily used. They had the power that came from being necessary, from being the ones who actually made everything work. The nobles were parasites, really, living off the labor of others while contributing nothing themselves. Without servants, Lord Edmund would be just a man in a cold stone building with no food and no fire and no clean clothes. That recognition didn't change anything practical, but it changed something in how Elinor saw the world. The nobles weren't superior beings, ordained by God to rule. They were just people who had been born lucky, who had inherited wealth and position through no merit of their own. And the servants weren't inferior beings, deserving of their suffering. They were just people who had been born unlucky, trapped in a system that exploited them without mercy. It was a simple realization, but it felt revolutionary. If birth was just luck, if position was just circumstance, then the whole structure of society was built on sand. There was no divine order, no cosmic justice. There was only power, and those who had it used it to take from those who didn't. As February drew to a close, the death toll continued to rise. Elinor had stopped trying to keep track of names, stopped trying to remember faces. It hurt too much to learn about someone to care about them, only to watch them sicken and die. She built walls around her heart, trying to protect herself from the constant grief, but the walls were never quite strong enough. The castle itself seemed to reflect the suffering within its walls. Ice hung from the battlements in great daggers, some as long as a man's arm. The stones were slick with frozen spray from the sea, making any movement outside treacherous. The sky remained gray day after day, a heavy blanket of clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. Snow fell almost constantly, sometimes light flurries, sometimes blizzards that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Inside, the contrast between the nobles' quarters and the servants' areas grew even more stark. The nobles had taken to wearing their lightest indoor clothes, complaining constantly of being overheated. Lord Edmund had 3 fires burning in his chambers at all times, plus braziers, and he had ordered extra furs for his bed because Lady Beatrice claimed she was cold at night despite the abundance of warmth. The great hall blazed with heat and light every evening, the massive fireplace consuming whole trees, the walls hung with additional tapestries to hold in warmth. The servants, meanwhile, were dying of cold. Not just the cold outside, though that was deadly enough, but the cold that came from within, from bodies that had no fuel to generate heat. Elinor would wake in the morning, if she had slept at all, and her breath would be visible in the air despite being pressed between 2 other bodies. Her fingers and toes were constantly numb, the color of old ivory, and she had lost feeling in her feet entirely. When she looked down at them, they seemed like foreign objects attached to her legs, things that belonged to someone else. She wasn't alone. All the surviving servants showed signs of advanced malnutrition and exposure. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken deep in their skulls. Their movements had slowed, become careful and deliberate, as if they were old people navigating treacherous ground. Their skin had taken on a grayish cast, and many had sores that wouldn't heal, infections that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. Brother Thomas did what he could, but his supplies of herbs and medicines were limited, and they did little good against starvation anyway. He had begun to look haunted, Elinor thought. The weight of all those deaths, all that suffering he couldn't prevent, was crushing him. She would see him sometimes in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, and she wondered what he prayed for. Did he ask God why this was happening? Did he question the divine order that made such suffering possible? Or did he simply pray for strength to endure, to bear witness to atrocity after atrocity without breaking? On the last day of February, something happened that crystallized everything for Elinor, that made the injustice so clear that even she, with her growing numbness, couldn't ignore it. It was late afternoon, the gray light already fading toward evening. Elinor was in the kitchen, stirring a massive pot of pottage that would serve as the servants' evening meal. The pot was even more watery than usual, the grains stretched so thin you could barely taste them, flavored with nothing but a bit of salt and some wilted onions. It would provide minimal nutrition and even less satisfaction, but it was all they had. As she stirred, she heard a commotion in the yard outside. Raised voices, the sound of horses and dogs. She glanced at Marjorie, who nodded permission for her to investigate. Elinor set down her ladle and went to the doorway, peering out into the frozen ward. Lord Edmund had returned from a hunting expedition. Despite the cold, Despite the danger of the icy ground and the thick snow, he had insisted on going out with a party of his nobles and guests. They had been gone since morning, and now they were back, flushed with success and cold air and wine from the flasks they carried. They had killed a deer, a magnificent stag that now hung from poles carried by two of the huntsmen. It was a beautiful animal even in death, its coat thick and glossy, its antlers impressive. Lord Edmund was practically glowing with pride, describing the kill to his companions, acting out the moment when his arrow had struck. But it wasn't the deer that caught Eleanor's attention. It was what the hunting dogs were eating. The dogs, massive coursing hounds bred for hunting, were being fed chunks of fresh venison as a reward for their work. Raw meat, rich and red, tossed to them by laughing nobles who praised their animals' prowess. The dogs caught the meat in midair, swallowed it in great gulps, then waited eagerly for more. They were sleek and healthy, their coats shining, their eyes bright. They were better fed than any of the servants, better cared for, more valued. Eleanor watched a noble toss a piece of meat that must have weighed a pound to his favorite hound. The dog caught it, chewed briefly, swallowed. That single piece of meat represented more food than Eleanor had eaten in the last 3 days combined. And it had been given to a dog, tossed carelessly, one treat among many. Something inside her snapped. She didn't make a conscious decision. Her body simply moved, driven by a hunger and a rage so overwhelming that thought became impossible. She ran forward into the yard, her feet slipping on the ice, and grabbed for the piece of meat that had just been tossed. The dog was faster than her, had already caught it, but Eleanor's hand closed on one end of the meat at the same moment the dog's jaws closed on the other. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The nobles stared at her in shock. The dog growled, low and threatening, pulling at the meat, and Eleanor, somewhere beyond reason now, pulled back. She needed that food, needed it more than the dog did, needed it to survive. The dog was well fed, healthy, strong. The dog would eat again tomorrow and the day after that. But Eleanor was dying. They were all dying, and she wasn't going to let a dog have food while she starved. The dog's growl intensified. It was a massive animal, bred for bringing down deer, with jaws strong enough to break bones. Eleanor knew she should let go, knew she was courting injury or death. But she couldn't. The hunger was too overwhelming, had consumed every other instinct. What in God's name? Lord Edmund's voice cut through the frozen air. The spell broke. The dog yanked hard, and Eleanor's numb fingers couldn't hold on. She fell backward onto the ice, landing hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. The dog trotted away with its prize, victorious. And Eleanor lay there, gasping, staring up at the gray sky, feeling the cold seep through her thin dress. Lord Edmund loomed over her, his face red with anger. "How dare you?" he said, his voice tight. "How dare you try to steal from my dogs? Do you have any idea what those animals are worth?" Eleanor couldn't speak. Her lungs wouldn't work, and even if they had, what could she say? That she was so hungry she would fight a dog for scraps, that the dog was worth more to him than she was. that his animals were better fed and better cared for than the humans who served him. "Get up," Lord Edmund commanded. When she didn't move fast enough, he gestured to one of his companions. "Get her up." Rough hands grabbed Elinor and hauled her to her feet. Her legs wouldn't quite hold her, and she swayed, held upright only by the grip on her arms. Lord Edmund stared at her, and for a moment something like confusion crossed his face. She wondered what he saw, a scarecrow in human form, all bones and hollow spaces, barely alive. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Why are you so thin? Are you ill?" The question was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that Elinor started to laugh. It came out as a croak, her throat too dry for real laughter, but she couldn't stop. Wrong with her, she was starving. They were all starving. How could he not see it? How could he live in the same castle, walk the same corridors, and not notice that the people who served him were dying? "Stop that," Lord Edmund snapped. "Stop laughing. I asked you a question." Elinor's laughter died as abruptly as it had begun. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who genuinely didn't understand. He wasn't deliberately cruel, she realized. He simply existed in a reality so different from hers that they might as well be living in different worlds. In his world, everyone had enough to eat. In his world, servants were healthy and well-fed, or if they weren't, it was because they were lazy or sickly, not because of anything he had done or failed to do. "I'm hungry, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're all hungry. We're starving." Lord Edmund frowned. "Nonsense. You're given perfectly adequate rations. Walter oversees the distribution himself." "The rations aren't enough," Elinor said, and even as she spoke she knew it was useless. "They're not enough to live on. We're dying, my lord. 12 servants have died since the start of February. 12 people dead from cold and hunger." 12. Lord Edmund looked genuinely surprised. He turned to the steward, Walter, who had emerged from the keep at the commotion. "Is this true? Have we lost 12 servants this month?" Walter consulted a small ledger he always carried. 14, actually, my lord. 2 more died last night. But we've replaced them, of course. The castle is fully staffed." "There you see," Lord Edmund said, turning back to Elinor as if this explained everything. "The castle is fully staffed. If people are dying, it's because they're weak or sickly, not because of any deficiency in their care. The strong survive. That's the natural order." Elinor stared at him, and in that moment she understood something fundamental. He genuinely believed what he was saying. To him, the servants weren't starving because he was feeding them adequately. If they died, it was because they were naturally weak, inferior specimens who couldn't withstand hardship. The thought that he might be responsible, that he might be killing them through neglect and cruelty, literally never entered his mind. "You threw more food to your dogs just now than I've eaten all week," Elinor said, and she was past caring about consequences now. What more could they do to her? She was already dying. You feast every night on food that could feed us for months. You live in warmth while we freeze. And you say we're weak. You say we're dying because we're inferior. My lord, if you lived as we do, you'd be dead within a week. The silence that followed was absolute. The nobles stared at her in shock. Servants didn't speak this way. Servants didn't challenge their betters. The social order depended on servants knowing their place, accepting their lot without complaint. For Elinor to speak truth to power, to point out the obvious injustice, was almost unthinkable. Lord Edmund's face had gone from red to white, and his hand moved to the sword at his belt. For a moment, Elinor thought he might actually strike her down right there. Part of her almost welcomed it. At least it would be quick, cleaner than slowly starving to death. But Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the tension. Edmund, don't. She had come out to see what the commotion was about, wrapped in furs, her breath misting in the cold air. The girl is clearly mad with hunger. Look at her. She's half dead already. It would be beneath you to strike a dying woman. Mad with hunger. As if starvation was a form of insanity, rather than a rational response to deprivation. But her words seemed to reach Lord Edmund, seemed to give him a way to interpret Elinor's behavior that didn't threaten his worldview. Of course, the servant was acting strangely. She was mad, deranged. It wasn't that she had a legitimate complaint. It was that her mind had been affected by illness or weakness. Get her out of my sight, Lord Edmund said, his voice cold. Take her to the infirmary. Let Brother Thomas deal with her. And if she's too mad to work, turn her out. I won't have her disturbing the peace of the castle. The hands holding Elinor dragged her away. She didn't resist. There was no point. She had spoken her truth, and it had made no difference whatsoever. Lord Edmund would return to his feast that evening, would eat his fill of the very deer his dogs had helped to catch, and he would never think about this incident again. It would be forgotten, dismissed as the ravings of a sick servant, meaningless and unimportant. Brother Thomas examined her in the infirmary, his gentle hands checking her pulse, looking into her eyes, feeling the bones that pressed against her skin. Advanced starvation, he said quietly. Exhaustion. The beginning of lung fever, I think. Child, you're very ill. I know, Elinor said. Are you going to help me or turn me out? I'll do what I can, Brother Thomas said. But Elinor, you must understand. What you did today, speaking to Lord Edmund that way, it was dangerous. You could have been killed. I'm being killed anyway, Elinor said. Just more slowly. Brother Thomas had no answer to that. He gave her some willow bark tea for the fever she hadn't known she had, and a tiny piece of bread spread with honey. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, so intense after weeks of bland pottage that she almost cried. He let her rest on one of the infirmary beds, the one that had been occupied by Lady Beatrice's maid, who had recovered and returned to her duties. The bed was soft, the blanket warm, and for the first time in months Elinor felt almost comfortable. She slept, and in her sleep she dreamed of food, roasted meat and fresh bread, cheese and fruit, all the things she had served but never tasted. In her dream she was at a feast, but this time she was the one being served, and the nobles were the ones standing against the walls, watching with hollow eyes as she ate her fill. She woke to find Brother Thomas sitting beside her bed, his old face creased with concern. "You were talking in your sleep," he said, "saying things about justice and God's will. Elinor, I'm worried about you. Not just your body, but your soul. You're developing dangerous thoughts." "Dangerous to whom?" Elinor asked. "To yourself primarily," Brother Thomas said. "This anger you feel, this sense of injustice, it will eat you alive. You must find a way to accept your circumstances, to find peace within them. Otherwise, the bitterness will consume you." "Maybe I want to be consumed by bitterness," Elinor said. "Maybe that's better than being consumed by hunger." Brother Thomas sighed. "I've been at this castle for 30 years, he said. "I've seen hundreds of servants come and go. Do you know what I've learned? The ones who survive are the ones who accept. The ones who make peace with their lot, who don't spend their energy raging against things they cannot change. The angry ones, the ones who question and challenge, they burn out quickly. Either they die of the stress, or they do something foolish that gets them killed, or they simply give up. Acceptance isn't surrender, child. It's survival." "And what about change?" Elinor asked. "If everyone just accepts, nothing ever changes. The system continues, generation after generation, grinding people up and spitting them out." "Some things aren't meant to change," Brother Thomas said. "The social order is ordained by God. Nobles rule, servants serve. That's how it's always been, how it always will be. To fight against it is to fight against God himself." "Then maybe God is wrong," Elinor said, and watched Brother Thomas flinch as if she'd struck him. "That's heresy," he whispered. "You must never say such things. Never even think them." "I can't help thinking them," Elinor said. "Not after what I've seen. Not after watching people die while others feast. If God ordained this system, if he wants things to be this way, then he's not the loving father the church claims. He's a tyrant, no better than Lord Edmund." Brother Thomas stood abruptly, his face pale. "I can't listen to this," he said. "I won't. You're very ill, and illness can affect the mind, make you think things you don't truly believe. I'll pray for you, Elinor. I'll pray that you recover both your body and your faith." He left her then, and Elinor was alone in the infirmary. She should have felt afraid. She had essentially confessed heresy to a monk, which could lead to terrible consequences. But she felt only a strange calm. She had spoken the truth as she saw it, had refused to pretend that the world was just or fair or divinely ordered. And while that might cost her, at least she had been honest. She rested in the infirmary for 2 days. Brother Thomas continued to treat her, giving her slightly better food than the other servants received. Barley water, a bit of broth, small pieces of bread. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in weeks, and she felt some of her strength returning. The fever subsided, and the fog that had clouded her thoughts began to clear. But she couldn't stay in the infirmary forever. On the third day, Lord Edmund's falconer needed the bed again. One of his birds had torn his arm badly, and Elinor was sent back to the servants' quarters. She returned to find the space more crowded than ever, new faces filling the empty pallets. The cycle continued. Servants died, new servants arrived, the castle ground on. March arrived with no improvement in the weather. If anything, the cold intensified, as if winter was making one final, desperate attempt to hold back spring. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes that piled up faster than it could be cleared. The wind howled without ceasing, finding every crack and gap in the castle's defenses. The sea churned gray and violent, sometimes sending spray so high it reached the highest towers. Elinor returned to work in the kitchen, but something had changed. The other servants looked at her differently now, with a mixture of fear and respect. Word had spread about her confrontation with Lord Edmund, about the things she had said. Some avoided her, afraid of being associated with someone who had challenged authority so openly. Others sought her out, speaking to her in whispers, sharing their own stories of suffering and injustice. One evening, after the nobles had retired and the kitchen work was done, a small group gathered around Elinor in the servants' quarters. There was Peter, the blacksmith's assistant, and a girl named Alice who worked in the laundry, and Thomas, an older man who tended the stables, and several others. They spoke quietly, careful not to be overheard. "Is it true what you said to Lord Edmund?" Alice asked. "About us starving while they feast?" "Yes," Elinor said. "Every word." "I've been here 5 years," Thomas said, his voice rough. "And every year it's the same. They reduce our rations, but never their own. They feast while we freeze. And if we complain, we're punished or turned out. I've thought about leaving, finding work elsewhere, but where would I go? It's the same everywhere. The nobles take everything, and we get what's left, if anything." "It doesn't have to be this way," Peter said, his young face fierce. "In London, I've heard, the workers band together. They form guilds, demand fair treatment. They have power because they have numbers. London isn't a castle in the middle of nowhere," Thomas replied. "London has laws, courts, places where workers can appeal for justice. Here, there's only Lord Edmund. He is the law. He is justice, or his version of it anyway." "So we do nothing?" Alice asked. "Just accept it." "What choice do we have?" Thomas spread his hands helplessly. "We're trapped here. If we leave, we'll likely die. If we stay and complain, we'll be punished. If we try to organize to resist, we'll be crushed. There's no way out." "There's always a way out," Elinor heard herself saying. "Maybe not a way that leads where we want, but a way nonetheless. We just have to decide what we're willing to risk." They all looked at her, waiting for her to continue. But Elinor didn't know what to say. She had no plan, no solution. She just knew that accepting the status quo, enduring in silence, felt like a kind of death in itself. But what was the alternative? Rebellion would be suicidal. Flight was nearly impossible in winter, and individual acts of resistance, like her attempt to take food from the dog, accomplished nothing except to mark you as a troublemaker. The conversation dissolved without resolution, everyone returning to their pallets, their questions unanswered. But something had shifted. The servants had begun to talk to each other, to share their experiences, to recognize their common suffering. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless in practical terms, but it felt significant to Elinor. Consciousness, she thought, was the first step toward change, even if that change was far in the future.